I love that question because it's unanswerable, really. And I'll try to tell you why I think it's unanswerable. Although, of course, it's answerable in many different ways. So, money is, in my view, an instance, an example of an expressive capacity that is in the process of evolving. Now, that's a complicated phrase there. But what I'll start out with a couple examples about what that might be like. If you think about pictographic writing in the early days, what was pictographic writing? It was an example of a way to transmit meaning across space and time. And the encoding mechanism for transmitting meaning was the shape of the thing you were trying to encode meaning about. So if you have a pictogram of a carrot, it's a little drawing of a carrot, and you encode the meaning carrot in something that looks like a carrot. So pictograms are an example of an expressive capacity that we know as writing. Money is an example of an expressive capacity that we are actually just discovering the very beginning of what it is. And the way I describe it is the capacity to interact with, shape, see, modify flows that build value in the context of social organisms. Now, so you can see maybe I've been thinking about this stuff for a long time. I got a lot of words. So I'm going to let you ask some questions and see if that takes you anywhere or that's worth something, or if you want me to go on.
So how does that relate to me in my everyday life and my usage? When I go to Starbucks.
That's a great question. Okay, so if you were a person who couldn't write and you learned how to write in pictograms, that relates to your everyday life. All of a sudden you have the capacity to express meaning across space and time, right? But if you want to write down a word like belief or it or any abstract concept, you can't do it. So money is similar to pictograms. Money is a way of encoding value, but it's only good for encoding certain kinds of value that is about tradable wealth. As soon as you get to the realms of wealth, of which most of them are non-tradable, measurable wealth, acknowledgeable wealth, rankable wealth, all these other forms of wealth, money is a terrible system for encoding that kind of wealth. And so in our societies, we have a terrible capacity to be able to deal with those forms of wealth. We're really great at creating tradable stuff. Look at all the plastic crap from China, tons of it. But education, well-being, all these things that they're falling apart because we're actually trying to encode the wealth that they provide using money, which is not the proper mechanism. Just like trying to use pictograms to encode abstract concepts. You can't do it. So how does it affect you daily? If we had new forms of money is really even the wrong word. If we knew what that expressive capacity was about and we understood the broader picture of it, then we're in an entirely new place because we can, on a day-to-day basis, encode that value and build it, which we can't as a social organism that our society is today. Does that make sense? To me, it feels like we're at a nexus point of all kinds of cultural transformations that are making it necessary for us to transcend what money was and to actually understand that money is one instance of some greater expressive capacity that we need to actually learn what it is and actually become part of. And we're hitting all kinds of barriers. I mean, people talk about peak oil, but there's peak everything right now. It's not just oil. One of the most interesting ones is peak hierarchy. Our method of organizing ourselves socially is failing because hierarchical organization systems can no longer deal with the complexity of the scale that we've reached in wrapping around the planet and in just the sheer number of people, just the numerosity of us. So money was fine up to a point, just like you can use pictograms up to a point. But when you get to a place where you have to express more complicated things and you want to actually build different kinds of wealth, you can't use it. It just doesn't work because the systemics are all out of whack. And so I'm not sure I'm really answering your question, but you see where I'm getting is that we've reached a place where we can't do what we would like to do with the tools at hand. I can only give you analogies because it goes like this. It's going to sound a little bit weird, but put yourself in the frame of mind of proto-hominids who, early chimpanzees, or in past chimpanzees, but on the way to humans. And what they've got as an expressive capacity socially is the capacity to talk about their emotions. Eek, I'm afraid, right? And, some nice sound that feels like, oh, okay, I'm in a happy place. So their expressive capacity is about their emotions. But what they need to do is they actually need to start talking to each other about things in the outside world. They need to talk representationally. And so they're trying to evolve, they're trying to create, because of their need of organization, their survival needs, they want to be able to express things about, there is a tiger, don't go there in the afternoon. You can't do that in emotional expressive capacity. Because emotional expressive capacity is about a synthesis of the state of the whole being of oneself. It has nothing to do with the outside world. Now, you can start to use emotional expressions to refer to outside things. And if both parties know that you're doing that, then you can say, eek, that means tiger. And eek, eek means tiger coming to you. But there's a problem, which is you're not going to get very good expressivity if every time you say there's a tiger, or if there were a tiger, you get scared. You're not going to be able to actually deal with the concepts because your emotions get in the way. So it's a long-winded analogy, but there's this difference between what can be represented in emotional expressive capacity and what can be represented in representational expressive capacity, i.e. language. So take that analogy, emotions and language, two different expressive capacities. Right now, the expressive capacity that we lack as a society is the one that builds healthy flows in social organisms. It's a whole different thing that needs to be talked about. So money is an early way to talk about the flows of well-being. And it's good for talking about the flows of things that are tradable. But we don't have an expressive capacity, an underlying language structure that doesn't bring us right back into thinking about concepts and words and representational stuff, when we actually need to be thinking in terms of feedback loops and flow patterns and all this other stuff that we just actually don't even know how to do well, especially at the social level, the arena of having an organism, a social organism, be able to see itself and manipulate itself into well-being. Do you see that jump that I'm talking about here? That's what's happening right now, is the jump of those proto-hominids going from emotion to language. We're doing the same thing. We're going from language, well, I don't know if going from is the right word, but we're developing this new expressive capacity, which we don't have words for yet, because if you're thinking in emotions, you can't talk in words because you don't have them yet. But I can tell that that's what's going on right now.
Okay, hold on.
So one of the things I know you want is you want concreteness. But imagine if you're sitting around with emotional expressive capacity and you're trying to talk about something that doesn't exist yet. But you know you need it because proto-hominids, they can think representationally. Internally, there's no problem. They know there comes a tiger. They've got all this cognitive capacity at the representational level that is not matched by an expressive capacity at the social level. That's where we are. We have massive cognitive capacity around flows and patterns and wealth and well-being, and we've got representational language. We know about gifts, and we know about all kinds of different things. But what we do is we think about this. We think there's a gift and there's an exchange. And there's a million different shades in between there that have to do with flow patterns of well-being, about establishing reputation, establishing trust, and all these different aspects that if we could do in the social realm, the way we know how to do sort of internally in small clusters of humans, but if we could do that scaled up, that's a different thing. And getting back to your first question, money, what is that? It's an early experiment in this capacity. It's like money is eek, which doesn't mean I'm scared. It means there's a tiger. So once we get to the place where we say, there's a tiger over there and that one looks like it's well fed, so don't worry. Now, think about what that does, what capacity that gives to the group of people who can say that. Well, if we have the capacity to create systems that allow us to talk about the value that's flowing around us and through us, and we can create that as easily as I can create these words. I'm generating these words right now, bam, 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 because I've got this whole underlying expressive capacity called language. Now, if we had that for systems that allow us to see and move and participate in all the levels of wealth, now that's pretty interesting.
What's your vision of what world would that create for us that's different now? And I know we're talking emergent, so
right.
It's...
There's not anything that isn't different. Let's put it that way. When I've sat and thought about this, I can't see if you, I mean, it's like saying, if you have language, when all you had before was emotional, if you could only talk about your emotions, what's going to be different? There isn't anything that isn't different. You can talk about your emotions. You can talk about anything you want to talk about. And so everything changes. I mean, the difference is I mean, I can't tell you what it'll be, except to tell you that everything will be different. But that's not surprising because we need everything to be different. We know that all of our social institutions aren't providing us what we would like them to. At every single one of them. Name one that you wouldn't like to be different in some way. And that isn't becoming different anyways.
Consciousness.
Okay, so more concretely. All of the social institutions that we're part of, churches, governments, states, countries, schools, clubs, every single one of them, you can think about as a living organism. It's an organism. It's a social organism. But the kind of social organism we have right now, they have the organism itself, the corporation, the club, the country, has an extremely limited capacity to know what it itself is and to create itself. It's not, create itself is really the wrong word. To be healthily enmeshed in all the rest of the social environment. That's what's not available. Almost all of our social organisms work on one principle, which is survival of the fittest and competition in fighting. And that's what's possible to change. It's possible to make our social organisms be as rich and cooperative as all of the cells of our body are rich and cooperative to create a whole that actually is healthy. Most of our social structures end up being cancerous because what we basically have is things that want to grow until they fail. And that's the definition of cancer. Now, if there were the possibility of actually knowing what the DNA is of social organisms and constructing that DNA so that it creates healthy social organisms, that's a different world. And it means that that almost all of the social organisms that you're a part of, they're always asking one question: where can I get more money? I don't have enough money to do what I need to do. That's the one question that's being asked everywhere. And we think that that's the only question. It feels natural. It's kind of like, where can I get more sunlight? But we think that that's what's going on because we actually are so embedded in this competitive structure that is at the heart of what the monetary system requires of us. It's not natural. It's an outgrowth, and I'm sure you know all about that. So the question then is, how do you create the DNA of social organisms? And the answer, in my view, is if you really understand that money is one instance of this expressive capacity, and the sentences in that expressive capacity, the paragraphs, are those chunks of DNA that create social organism and create the flow of well-being of those organisms. I don't know. I guess I'm just too close to the work that I've been doing and this other way of looking at it. So it's hard to be introductory. That's not my strength.
Okay.
But I don't know. Actually, I mean, I've had a fair amount of success when people say, "What do you do?" and I say I work on ways in which all the communities that we're a part of can build wealth without using money. Now, that's pretty normal, right? The idea, everybody understands that wealth, if you ask them, if you ask the question, what is wealth? People they'll talk about money for a little bit, but very quickly they'll say, my friends, food, so the tradable wealth stuff, but then they'll get right into the relational, my health, my education. So people understand that health is not money. And they also have they understand the way in which wealth is produced in family settings, where if you tried to track exchanges, you would destroy wealth. And so it becomes you can get into the conversation pretty quickly about, well, how can we extend those patterns to the social system at large, or at larger, at least. So I go down that route. I mean, to change so there's this movement called the complementary currency movement, I see that as a very small blip in this place where a bunch of people have realized, heck, we don't have to use money. So what are we going to do instead? Because we can make it ourselves. We can start using mutual credit and just write IOU slips. It happened during the Irish banking shutdown, where people just kept the checks going around. And you realize we don't have to use money. We can make it ourselves. It's just an agreement. But then really, what is this stuff? And what are we using it for? And how are our communities being healthy? And the questions escalate extremely rapidly into these much more deep questions about what is a healthy social organism. And once you get there, you're like, okay, well, we need a capacity to talk about all these ways in which we record information that records the flows that are happening here, the flows of education, the flows of attention, the flows of participation, the flows of stuff. That's the tradable part, but all those other ones are the non-tradable parts. And if you see that, then, oh, you can just like let go of the whole money thing. And at least that's where I try to go with this. I used to be a money guy, but I don't think I'm dealing with money at all anymore, really. It's the small thing. So the Metacurrency project, what I'm working on, is an attempt to create that expressive capacity. It's an attempt to say, oh, okay, there are monies that can be used for tracking exchange. There are reputation currencies that help build and establish the flows of reputation. There are participation metrics that help understand when people are in or out of communities and help build the membranes of communities. There are all these formal information systems that build wealth. Now, is there a way, a kind of grammar, are there patterns that are general across all of those that will allow us to be able to speak these into being quickly and easily? And of course, our idea is, yes, there are. And that's what the Metacurrency project is about. It's about creating a language for creating these currencies. And language, I use that in quotes, because language is really the stuff we're doing right now. It's actually an expressive capacity. We're trying to create a new expressive capacity in tons of ways. In fact, we do it all the time, and we're not used to it. I mean, we're just not used to the fact that these things are other instances of the same thing that money is one instance of. So when you see a USDA organic sticker, that is a currency. It's issued in the same way currency is issued. It's non-tradable. You can't trade your USDA sticker. So that's one of its rules in the rule of its currency. And what it's good for is helping people see a certain category that a certain set of food is in. So that is you can think of it as a categorization metric. It measures whether this food is in this kind of grouping, that it lives up to a certain value that I have. So if you start to see the life cycle of the issuance of those kinds of tokens, and you look at the patterns behind that and realize that, oh, all of these information systems that help us build wealth, that's one of them. You actually know how to interact with food better. The flow of food through your family life or through your body even is better if there's a USDA sticker that you can choose from. And if you don't care about organic, you don't do that. Or if you don't believe that USDA organic is a real one, you go for the Cal organic or which the other one is. Each one of those tokens is issued into existence and gives you information about wealth, that helps you create your own well-being. So there's the pattern, right? And seeing that, oh, there's a life cycle, an issuance of a token, just like money is issued, but this one's not an exchange-based one. What's the underlying pattern of there? Here's another couple examples. Grades, credits, and degrees. Now those are also currencies, the way I look at what a currency is, where grades are performance metrics, and credits are achievement metrics, and degrees are sort of a summation of all of those, that they're used by the social organism to help monitor the flow of a student through and into society so they can participate better or not in various institutions in the social organism. Now, let's leave aside whether those are good currencies, because there's all kinds of problems with grades, credits, and degrees. That's something that we want. But if we knew how they were issued and we knew their properties and we matched them up well and understood them and could create these things on the fly with the robustness that I can speak language, then we would be able to create them obviously by definition, in better ways. That's what I'm trying to get at. You see where that goes? I see this conversation as all right, I'll just stop there. Go ahead. Okay, let's get back to the pictograms. Okay, if I wanna talk about belief, an abstract concept in a pictogram, what am I gonna do? Well, I know the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to make something up and arbitrarily say, we believe in God is our sun, the sun is God, so let's draw a sun whenever we mean belief. And we'll put some squiggles around it to differentiate it from the one that means sun, right? So you can do it. You can make an arbitrary symbol there. But when you get to a place where you realize that you don't have to encode meaning in the shape of the thing itself, then you get to a new place and you can start to say, oh, okay, meaning is separate from shape, from physical form. Meaning has its own reality. I've been deceived before that I used to think meaning was always encoded in the shape because of the way I do that. I don't know, maybe they weren't deceived, but at least you didn't know what to do. We're in that same place where we think value is encoded in scarcity. So that which is scarce is valuable. I've had conversations with people who say, oh, yeah, the things that are valuable are scarce. I mean, a moment's thought of taking yourself out of the regular pattern of things, you realize that that's not true at all. The air we breathe is incredibly valuable. We would die if it wasn't here. It's not scarce, so it doesn't have scarcity value. But the question then is, how do you encode the value of something that's not scarce? Well, so getting back to the grades, credits, degrees, and the USDA stickers, you see each one of those is a pattern that right now what we're doing is we're doing like belief encoded as a sun. We just do one-offs. Each one of them we'll create it because we know we need it. We need to do USDA organic. But what we don't have is an underlying pattern that brings these information token systems into existence, that is interoperable, that every community can plug into and start to use. Like, I'm going to refer to USDA organic and tag this onto it and add value meaning onto that value meaning token in a way that builds much more value because there's this expressive capacity around it, just like language. As soon as you get into being able to have all of a grammar and you can put things in the right slots, nouns and verbs and adjectives and the rest, you're in a totally different place than if the only thing you can say is eek, right? There's that difference, and it's the same back with the pictograms. As soon as you jump away from pictograms and say, we can encode meaning with the sounds we use. Oh, now I've got an alphabet. The story is totally different in the amount of writing you can do. So I know I'm throwing in 3 different images here at the same time to try to get across the story of expressive capacity, but that's where I am. What this thing is about is the evolution of expressive capacity, which is absolutely huge because the evolution of consciousness is tied to the evolution of expressive capacity. It's almost the same thing. Yeah, it was great. One of the biggest things we faced was the dearth of parts and products of systems. The stuff that's tradable, that really is scarce. And so it's really good. If you figure out a mechanism for encoding the things that are scarce and dealing with scarcity stuff, then you manage to produce tons and tons of stuff that otherwise would have been scarce. Look at all the stuff we have. It's incredible how much stuff we have and how much we can make. And if you've got control of the system that makes stuff flow around, scarce stuff, then you get lots of it. If you don't, you're hosed. But the actual productive capacity of scarce stuff, of what was scarce before on this planet, is unbelievable. Well, it's going to destroy the planet, right? Because one of the things that it requires is the production right now of lots and lots of carbon, which is a dangerous thing to do. You don't want to throw lots of carbon into the atmosphere. And up to a point, it doesn't matter a whit because we're so small. But when we get so big, it matters a huge whit. And so if your system for moving stuff around the planet has the byproduct of wanting to produce more and more carbon, well, it's going to give you trouble at some point. That's the place we're at. We got to fix it. But that thing about that I was just saying is that it's interesting. Production of scarce stuff, food, getting things out of the ground that was scarce, and creating things in factories, factory production, which creates all kinds of cool stuff. Clothes used to be, good cloth was incredibly scarce. Very, very difficult thing to do. Looms, crank it out by the tons and tons. Well, so we've got that licked, but distribution is not subject to scarcity issues. It's at a different level. And so the well-being created by different types of distribution of all that stuff, that well-being is structurally totally different than the well-being of having stuff, just the mere production of it. And so that thing we haven't solved. And our social systems has no good solution to distribution. That's why we have massive, massive inequity. And in fact, actually, the current social structure forces the inequity by its by its underlying structure. But so as soon as we realize that distribution is one form of wealth, and we can start to think about what are the information token systems that will help us actually handle distribution issues, where stuff should go, why it should go there, for according to which values. Well, do we have the social tools to do that? Nope, that's not part of our expressive capacity yet, but it will be. Well, once you see that there's a possibility of an expressive capacity, once you see that, oh, we actually need to be able to figure out how to encode in a general way wealth and well-being, and we need to understand the different levels of wealth, then you just start doing it, and you see that, oh, okay, so there's tradable wealth at this lowest level, that's the smallest stuff, and then there's measurable wealth that's not tradable. So tradable wealth is the parts and products of systems. You know, your blood is tradable. Now, what is non-tradable wealth, but that's measurable maybe? Well, the properties of the system as a whole. So maybe in your case, how fast you can dig ditches, or how many miles, how many seconds or minutes it takes you to run a mile. That's a property of you as a whole. It's non-tradable. But I can measure it, and measuring it can be extremely useful in getting you to be able to run faster or more slowly. Right? And actually embedding those measurements into rule systems that we agree to. And people do this all the time. It's like, okay, let's run a mile today and we'll see how long it takes us. And next tomorrow, I'll run a little bit faster, because I know that if I get to such and such miles per minute, then I'll be a healthier person. I'll be able to run the marathon and so on. You've just changed your well-being by virtue of the measurement that you've done of a non-tradable piece of your well-being. So that's individual. Scale that up to the community. How do communities make measurements of all these different levels of wealth? So I just jumped one up, which is measurable but not tradable. And there's more that go outside of that. But as soon as we as a community start doing that, and we've got basically templates, patterns, notions that this is what goes on, then we can start doing it. And so the Metacurrency project is writing some software. You know, everything boils down to software right now, because it's software, and the web is the way in which we share these bits of information. So it comes out as a pattern that will allow people to create currencies just the same way they can create a Google group right now. So one of the things we've done as an example is we've created a currency specification language in which you say, okay, in this currency, what are the types of transactions you can have? Well, if it's a monetary currency, one of the transactions would be trade. And how do you measure the sum of all of the transactions? I mean, how do you measure the aggregate of all of the transactions? In money, we're used to balances. Right? What's your balance? Did I go positive or negative? That's the sum of the transactions. Now, if the currency is about reputation, well, the transaction type is not going to be trade, it's going to be rating. What's your rating of such and such a restaurant, or such and such a person's capacity to be a good filmmaker, or whatever it might be. And then the aggregate sum of the aggregate of the transactions is no longer a balance, because a balance of your ratings doesn't make sense, but an average might well make sense, because it gives you a sense of the overall view of how people think of the rated entity. So if you got a language that says what are the transaction types, what are the aggregation types, and what are the rules by which people can create transactions, so some currencies might be issued, right? There's issuance rules, and you hook those things together, and you make it easy to say, okay, I'm going to pick and choose from these different transaction types and this different summary type. That's one step in the direction of creating an expressive capacity. So that's what we're trying to do, create tools that do those kinds of things and explore and figure out what this really is.
And is it being implemented?
Yeah, when you did the play shop, did you guys get onto the flow place?
Yeah, we did.
Okay, so the flow place uses XGFL, which is the extensible game format language that I developed with my colleagues. And so how many currencies did you play with?
And I sadly missed most of the
Right.
show.
Okay.
I've been working on
Right,
this.
right. Well, so the flow place, which is one of the pieces of software that I developed to actually use this language, I've created like 6 or 7 different types of currencies that you can create on the fly. You just say, okay, I want a reputation currency, I want a true, good, and beautiful currency, I want an issued currency, and I want this currency. Because once you have this language, it becomes actually really easy to say, oh, I want this kind of currency that does this, and I want to track that. And all of a sudden you're in a different place because it's really easy to crank them out. So that's been one of our prototype spaces where we've been trying to test these ideas out. And, and the Metacurrency project is in the middle of doing a bunch of other ones. Right now, that's what I was doing before you got here, coding away on the next generation platform that's going to allow us to do, I think, many more interesting things. Okay. Well, the current rules of the issuance of money require us to compete for it. So as soon as we realize that that's what's a required feature by the current rules, we're going to say, that's dumb. We don't have to compete in that way for everything. We can make some competition for the parts where it's actually fun to compete and it's worth competing because it's actually natural. But we right now are deceived that competition is natural to the degree that we think it is. And so one of the things we won't be doing is competing for money. That's kind of, I mean, the way we compete for money, I don't know if you've heard this before, but the way we compete for money is as if you were a carpenter and every time you wanted to measure the length of this piece of wood here, you had to buy your inches because your inches were issued by an inch issuing agency, right? Money is actually a measuring tool for tradable wealth flows, and issuing it and treating it as if it were itself tradable, as if it were itself valuable, is an insanity. And when we realize that, we'll stop doing a lot of things that we do right now. Now, we still will issue tokens to track the flows of scarce objects. And we will do it in precisely the same scarcity as the object, as opposed to our current monetary system, which issues a hell of a lot more money than the actual scarcity, and that's called inflation. But they try to keep that down. But that's a separate issue, and I don't really like to go there very much. But the point being that our relationship with money will be entirely different when we actually see it not as something valuable in and of itself, but as a tool for tracking that which is valuable, which we don't. As much as we can say we do, we don't. Because actually, it is valuable in and of itself in the current arena. It just doesn't have to be that way. So the Metacurrency project right now is a collaboration of interested parties. So there's a number of us who have come to this place, and what we've really tried to do is make sure that the people who are playing at the Metacurrency project level have got it into their heads that money isn't the main issue, that the main issue is being able to create healthy social organisms. And once you know that, then you think about currency in this wider view. And so there's a group of people who've gotten that and said, yeah, that is where I want to play. And so I collaborate with them in terms of Skype calls and coding and designing the underlying internet architectures that will allow us to actually, I think, create an expressive capacity to do this stuff. So it's a lot of research, and it's talking to people like you who are clearly getting it and seeing it and wanting to share the word, spread the word. There's a lot of self-discovery too, just trying to figure out what the heck's going on, because this changes very rapidly. I wouldn't have told you this story a year ago. Well, the first people who will want to interact are pioneers, people who are willing to go and I mean, so it's kind of like the question you're asking is similar to saying, well, if people who want to interact with the trip to the Americas, where are they going to interact? Well, first they're going to go to the shipyards and help us build the ships. And then they're also going to go to the cartographers' yards and talk about how to do maps. And then you're going to go and sit around the coffee shop and think about what it means if the world actually were round. What would be different? And try to get that into your head, because it's really hard to think that way. So there's websites, metacurrency.org, which is where we do stuff. There's some blogs that we have, newcurrencyfrontiers.org, and we blog personally, talk about stuff. So you'd start playing. And then if you're really a pioneer, you might do some things like my friend and colleague Jean-François Noubel has done, which is decided to stop using money as a vow of wealth. And then make it real for yourself that you can do that. It's possible. It's actually not jumping off the cliff, that it will build value. And you can experiment that way too, I guess. I've just got to go back to those proto-hominids, right? So imagine you're sitting there and you've been saying eek, and then you realize that you're having this emotion, but you didn't want to have the emotion. You realize that inside, you wanted to say tiger. You were just thinking about tigers and you said eek and then you were scared, but you said there's no tiger here. I'd like to be able to talk about a tiger without being afraid. And if I could do that, imagine what I could tell my friends. Imagine what a world we'd live in if I could do that. Well, I've had that experience. So if we had this expressive capacity, I know how different the world would look. And I don't know what it would look like, but I know how different it would look. And I want that. And so here's what inspires me. I feel domesticated. I feel that humanity and myself, we are domesticated. That's what we did 3,000 to 5,000 years ago when we invented writing and agriculture. We domesticated animals, we domesticated plants, and we domesticated people. First, we did it as slaves and overmastery, but then we domesticated ourselves. And so I have the experience of the possibility of going free, of becoming Cimarron, is the term that is used by Jim Corbett for that. The creature that goes free again, that becomes undomesticated, that becomes renaturalized. This vision of the world for me personally is that we will become renaturalized, where there will no longer be nature and us. Now that's really exciting. I mean, it's exciting from the point of view of just my kids, that I know that if that was real, and real not in a going back and playing in the woods with my face all dirty kind of way, but really deeply renaturalized, where a full 9 billion of us can live on the planet and be renaturalized. Well, my kids will have a much nicer place to live in, but at a spiritual level and at a psychological level and at a personal level, I know how exiled I am from everything around me. And I don't want that. So that's my inspiration. Well, there I have a leg up on you. I'm lucky. I'm fortunate because I was born in Ecuador. And so I've never been normal. And it's never been something that appealed to me either. And I remember, I've had conversations with friends who've said, well, you don't want your kids to feel like they're normal, that they belong. I never felt like I was normal and I belonged, and I didn't want to, and I'm happy with that. And I am just really grateful to my parents for being able to bring me up in a place where that was the case. So yeah, it's lonely, but and there are times, for me, it's the loneliness isn't so much the issue. It's the frustration. Like when you ask the question, how do you explain this to people? That's frustrating because I can't. It's not possible to explain it. You have to have been on the journey for a while and say, oh, something's not right here. And then I can give you these examples and maybe you get there. And it's really frustrating. Yeah, that's what's really frustrating, to not have people be able to share. I don't experience it as much as loneliness, but I'm sure that'll happen too. So I don't know. Well, I wish I were better at this, the whole talking thing. Well, the thing is, now I've come to see all of reality through this lens of expressive capacity. To me, it feels like the universe is built out of expressions, speakings. And that the part in the Bible where it says, in the beginning was the Word, that's not a mistake. So for me, if you look at every living creature on this planet, what is it? Well, there's this language, AGCAT, AGGCAT, DNA, right? Which are it's an encoding system. And when you use that encoding system and you put it through a factory called a parent, you produce a new expression in the language of DNA, which is some living being, a bacteria to a person. I see that as literally an expression. That's the expressive capacity of life. There's an informational encoding system that encodes whatever the expression is going to be, and it's generated through a speaker, the parent. That pattern to me is reflected all across the universe. So language is very obvious. the language we're using right now, we relate to them as expressions. They're expressions of our consciousness, expressions of awareness. They are expressions of meaning. So it's easy to see at those two lenses. I think the DNA one is pretty easy. But I see emotions also as expressive capacity, but they're about different things. So at each level, if you look at this tapestry, which is the universe, there are these really interesting structural levels that show up. Life is one of them. Language produced by humans is another one. But let's look at the emotions felt by humans. What is that? Humans and actually many, many other creatures, basically anything with from a reptile on up, anything that has a limbic system can feel emotions, can express, has the expressive capacity of synthesizing the whole of its own self. So, expressive capacity is the ability to generate into reality, into the social context, some level of truth or some level of what is. And so life is what is, it generates life. Emotions are the generating into the social capacity of how I feel as a whole. I'm happy, I'm sad. And there's many other emotional capacities that are generated, and they're of the whole self. If I'm hungry, I can feel that. I can feel the emotion of hunger. And we don't have a social capacity for it, but it is actually a projection in my head, and it's an expressive capacity of my being to be able to feel hunger, lust, jealousy, all these other emotional feelings. They're totally unrelated to all the other levels of expressive capacity. And what I see, the pattern in this place that we live in, is the increasing growing of these expressive capacities. And they grow within each level, and they grow as major thresholds and major jumping points where there's whole new layers that show up. So for example, language. We know that language has evolved over time, and writing is an expressive capacity that helps with language. It's not that much different. It's just over space and time. Actually over longer space and time. Already language is space and time because you're sitting further away. We encode it in vibrations of throats and so on and so forth. So encoding systems for transmitting certain layers of reality. Pretty interesting story. I mean, I actually look at physics as the same thing. It seems to me that molecules are encodings of subatomic particles. They're expressions. There's a lot of HHH hydrogen going on, a lot of expressions that produce that one. It's a good one. But once you've got, so this is the next cool part, right? If you've got an expressive capacity, as soon as you have one, a new one, a really new one, then you create all this novelty. It just spews all over the place. So the expressive capacity of being able to coalesce into atoms, that's great. You produce an entire universe out of that. And then there's a really interesting thing that happens at some point. Those things get together and form a new encoding system built on top of the old one, and that's the DNA one. Where once you got DNA, a new expressive capacity, look at all the light that spews out. When you get language, look at all the language that spews out. When we get to this next one, with value building and wealth building, whatever it is that money is an example of, we'll be generating tons and thousands of currencies, not really the right word for it, but those flow token information, so those formal information token systems that allow us to interact with and see and participate in flows. Well, same thing's going to happen.
And we're living in a different world.
Completely different. It's actually really, really scary. I think because it's so different. I think actually the fear of that is probably the main thing that's keeping it from not happening. Because everything changes. The houses we live in, the schools we go to, the marriages we inhabit, the friends we have, it all changes. But I'm a radical. Thank you for having the kind of listening that allows one to speak clearly. I appreciate that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel the frustration. God, what a task.